Good morning. Thanks very much for coming today. So this is the first time I've spoken at a non-Drupal event, so it's quite, well, not terrifying, I don't suppose. I think the Symfony community is quite nice and friendly as well. But what I wanted to talk to you about today was how we got to where we are right now with Drupal. So this is the story of Symfony, how Symfony became to be in Drupal 8. And I think more importantly, this isn't going to be a talk with loads of code in it. This is more about what the effect has been, how we've managed to integrate the communities, and what we actually need as the Drupal community from the Symfony community. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the effect on our community has been, and then a little bit on what does it really mean for you guys if you are working in the Symfony world at the moment. So why did I decide to put myself forward to speak to this particular crowd? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is Drupal's reputation problem. I've worked with many PHP developers, many Symfony developers outside of Drupal, and every single one is very, very reluctant to come anywhere near what we do. My aim today is to change one person's mind on that. Maybe all of you, but let's try for one. Let's start there. And then I want to tell you a little bit about where we are with Drupal 8. Drupal 8's been in development for quite a long time, but is very, very close to being ready. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions, if you have any. So the first part really is, how did we end up with Symfony in Drupal 8? So this goes way, way back in history. Drupal has been around since about 2000. It's been working through the different versions, and Drupal 7 is the one we're working with at the moment. And in 2011, Drupal 7 was already out at this point, Dries, who's the founder of Drupal, started to talk at the Drupalcon Chicago about a different way of approaching in Drupal 8. Because the historic problem that we'd had was that in Drupal 7, everything was committed by one or two people. There was this massive bottleneck. Everything was patch-driven. It's a patch-driven development, so the patches had to be reviewed and committed by one or two key people, Dries being one of them, Angie Byron being one of the others. So there was this massive bottleneck, and development was really constrained by this. So what was decided was that for Drupal 8, there was a lot we needed to do. And what we were going to do is going to break the different challenges that we faced with Drupal into these key initiatives. And they were going to be put together by different initiative leads, so spreading out the load a little bit. Now, I don't know whether any of these types of problems will come to pass in the sort of the Symfony community as well, but it was certainly one where we found that just having that central point was really slowing things down. So we were looking at the configuration management initiative, and what that was about was that Drupal historically, and right now in Drupal 7, it's very hard you've got a bit of a mix of features and content. A lot of the settings are in the database, and it's very hard to move between environments. We also needed to modernize for HTML5. There was an understanding that layouts needed improvement in Drupal as well, in terms of how you build pages. Mobile, obviously, certainly more now, but in 2011 it was very obvious that mobile was where things were going, and that we needed to be well aware of that, and of course that's exactly where we are today. Multilingual was always possible in Drupal, but was actually quite painful to do, so that was an initiative as well. Views was a particular module that allowed you to do lists of data, and everyone used it. Every Drupal site used this particular module pretty much all the time. So it was decided that we would move that into core, and then a focus on web services in general. So what I've done throughout here is I've put some minute links at the bottom. I don't expect you to read them, but if you want to get the slides afterwards, you can see a lot of the history. Because the interesting thing about open source, of course, is that you can see where these decisions came from. You can see the discussion that led up to them. And when I've been working on this particular talk, it's been about digging back through history, finding out when was that decision taken, how did that come about. So the particular initiative, in my interpretation, that really made the Symfony thing happen was this one called Whiskey, which was the Web Services and Context Core Initiative. This was led by Larry Garfield, who I think you may know is known as Krell on Twitter. So he's very well known in the Drupal community, but I think also in the PHP community as a whole. He took on this initiative, and the goal of the initiative was to make sure that Drupal was ready for the mobile web. So it was basically saying the web isn't about delivering pages anymore, which is traditionally where Drupal had come from for its all previous versions. So we needed to move to something that was about delivering data, and it didn't necessarily care about what format that data needed to be in. So this is where the Web Services Initiative was based. So we needed to understand things like partial page layouts, ESI, these sort of things that were important for enterprise scale applications. Where Drupal 7 was, and is, of course, is very much a largely procedural language, largely procedural framework, or CMS, and we can't even decide what it is. Some people think Drupal's a CMS, some people think it's a framework. There's no real answer to that. But the code inside was very much procedural. Very little object-oriented code in there, certainly no namespaces. The whole auto-loading was done by something called the registry in Drupal. And it's very, very hard to work with other frameworks. So historically, Drupal's been around a long time. There's very much been the not invented here syndrome in the community. I definitely wouldn't say that now, but going back five or 6 years. And then, of course, we've got 10 years of legacy. Although there's no, the way Drupal major versions work, we don't have to go to keep backwards compatibility between Drupal 6 and 7, for example. But however, lots of the code is brought over from one version to the next. So there's no PSR 0 support, and I'll be quite honest with you, I bet most Drupal developers don't even know what that means. So when Larry was looking, and the team that Larry was working with were looking at this, it was clear that Symfony already had a lot of this functionality available straight away. So this concept of symphonic Drupal didn't really stick, but it was referred to at some point, meant introducing all of these different Symfony components into Drupal. So the idea was that we would replace these custom things that Drupal had that were now available external to Drupal. So it was basically taking the foundations of Drupal and replacing it piece by piece. Not every single piece, but where it made sense, where we needed to improve, and where we needed to get better functionality in place. So all of these different elements were considered to put into Drupal for Drupal 8. Zend was also considered at this point, because in the end we needed a solid framework. And my understanding of the history, although I wasn't involved in the conversation, was that it did come down to a decision between Symfony and Zend, and I believe it was the actual community aspect that tipped it over to Symfony, in that the community was very responsive to the conversation that was happening in Drupal and was very interested in helping out. So we've gone from the not invented here syndrome to proudly found elsewhere, which I hear used quite a lot now. And once we had Symfony into the Drupal core, these other initiatives that were going on could see that they would be able to use these things as well. So it sort of came in through one angle, but once it was there, it meant all these other systems that we could think about using, and that's when the Drupal community really started to understand that they needed to look at Symfony and find out what it was all about and how it could benefit what they were doing. So what did it mean for us? Well, for the Drupal system, it meant a lot of removal of the legacy, the stuff that had been around forever, stuff that we knew wasn't as good as it should be, and this was a great opportunity to take some of that out. Hopefully, it was going to help us with the recruitment. It's very difficult to find a good Drupal engineers. So the aim here as well was to make Drupal more attractive to the likes of you, and also to new developers coming in, because it should be more modern code, more up-to-date, more standards-based. we needed to talk to the Symfony community and have the communities work well together, and hence coming to talk here. And also we've seen much more Symfony involvement in Drupal conferences as well. So it's been a great crossover. So we end up with a place where we've got this there's a whole piece of Drupal that's tested elsewhere. So we know it's solid, we know it's robust, and it's a modern toolkit. So a couple of other examples of where this came from. We have the configuration management initiative, which is what I mentioned earlier. So we've gone from a place where Drupal had to have, it didn't really have an official way of getting your configuration from one environment to the next, which meant you had to use some contributed modules, or even worse, reproduce your clicking on one system over here, trying to get it right both times. And now with Drupal 8, we have a complete configuration management system that's exportable to YAML. So again, these sort of side effects of bringing in Symfony, meaning that we can use standardize even on that, because before Drupal had these .info files, which were, they were just standard text, not that different to YAML, but they weren't a standard. They were standard in Drupal, but not really standard anywhere else. So this allows us to now bring our configuration into version control, and the place where Drupal is in the market at the moment, which is really heading towards sort of the enterprise level sites, this sort of stuff is absolutely vital. A little bit later on, we were also able to replace the theme layer. So Drupal's been run on PHP template. Although that theme system is replaceable, most people use PHP template because that's what it comes with. So there was a big initiative to bring Twig into Drupal 8. And this was a complete replacement. So it happened a little bit later than all the other stuff. But again, I think to me, it's one of those things that, well, it's here. We're using Symfony now. Let's use this part as well. And anyone who's worked with Drupal was probably aware of this whole devitis, whatever you want to call it. So much markup, so many divs, wrapping things that just don't really need to be there because of the way the theme system works. So we've now got in place, there's actually a theme called Classy, which is being worked on. And the aim is it's a Twig-based theme that you can extend, the idea being to completely strip out all of that unnecessary stuff. So that's a little bit of the history of how it came to be. And for the next part, I want to talk about what happened to the Drupal community as a result. This is the interesting part, because there's been it was a real shock. It was a real shock to the community because it was a big change of what was happening. But the first thing to understand is, completely generalizing the persona of a Drupal developer. I've worked with lots of Drupal developers. ICOS, the company that I work for, is a Drupal agency. We're part of Invika, but all of our developers are Drupal developers only. Yeah. So a lot of these people, not necessarily ours, but in the community, they're not necessarily software engineers. Lots of them are hobbyists. They've probably learned by looking at other modules in Drupal. So they've learned how to do code in Drupal by looking at Drupal. And a lot of them, and this is really important, have developed this real special niche of being a good specialist Drupal developer and doing Drupal the right way. And this is something that, since we've been part of Invika, has been really clear, is that just because you're a software engineer doesn't mean you can do Drupal without having this sort of history and understanding of how it works together. We're hoping in Drupal 8 that is going to be less. But right now, you've got all this whole community of people. Again, very generalizing, but I would say 60-70% of the community is probably like this. And then you've got definitely a hardcore of true software engineers. The people who work on Drupal core are amazing PHP developers. But the people who make the bulk of the community, the people who are building sites every day in Drupal, they don't have this. So what does this mean for this group? Well, so ever since that Symfony came into Drupal, Drupal 8 has been on the horizon. It's been a very long time, as you can imagine. 2011, it's 2015, we're still not there. It's been a big process. So what does it mean to this group of people out there right now? So it's uncertainty. They don't really know what's going to happen. These are not people that necessarily can contribute to Drupal core. There's a big risk. They may have built an entire business around knowing how to build Drupal, and suddenly Drupal might be changing from underneath them. They've got to have to relearn how to do Drupal. Not necessarily in terms of site building, which is very much the same, slightly improved, but in terms of building custom modules and that sort of thing. A lot of them, they're not trained software engineers necessarily. They might never have done object-oriented programming at all. They might not have done computer science or whatever related topics. So they've got this potential loss of status. They could go from rock star Drupal developer to completely not being able to do it at all, potentially. Absolute worst case scenario. So there's a lot of apprehension. And what I've seen out there is the 5 stages of grief. So there's the denial. No, this is completely wrong. Anger, bargaining, depression, and I'm glad to say, acceptance is about where we are right now. So yeah, the Drupal community has been through a bit of a process to get here. So I'm going to look at some of the other things that have happened as a reaction to this process. This is one of the big ones. Backdrop. I think it was in 2013 at Drupalcon Munich is when it first started being obvious what was happening. There's nothing wrong with forking an open source project, obviously. It's the way it works. So this system was a couple of really key people in Drupal community decided to fork Drupal 7 because they didn't like the way it was going. There was a feeling that object-oriented, or the code was not necessarily object-oriented code, but the fact that it was getting far too complicated and becoming more focused on the enterprise and leaving behind the small businesses and the hobbyists where Drupal had traditionally been. So the reason for doing Backdrop was really to keep it the same, keep the status quo. I don't speak for this team, but that was my understanding of what they were doing. They then have been backporting features from Drupal 8 into Drupal 7 architecture. So a labour of love, definitely. I don't know how much momentum they've really gained. It's certainly, at the time, it was a big shock to the community, but I think right now everyone is now, because everyone was in that, that anger phase or whichever phase it was they were in, now they've come to the acceptance phase. Mostly, from where I am anyway, I see most people now accepting that Drupal 8 is the way to go. So this fork could continue, and it probably will, but certainly Drupal 8 will drive on forward. So what we're now seeing as well is a big uptick, a big change in the number of people making core contributions to Drupal. So it used to be, I haven't got the exact figures here, but it used to be quite a small group of people that were working on core. And since we've introduced Symfony, again, one of the aims of the whole initiative was to attract more people. And we've had significantly more people working and submitting patches to core. What you might see at the moment is this big interest in decoupling. I don't know whether that's just a general interest in the industry at the moment or whether it's a Drupal 8 specific thing, but all over the place, I'm seeing people talking about headless Drupal, headless systems, decoupled systems, all the same thing. And what you're seeing is those are all over the place now. So it could be that is a result of one of the intents of Drupal 8 was that it was going to deliver data, it was going to be web services based, and therefore a decoupled system just makes sense. It could also be that because the front end is not quite ready yet, people want to use Drupal 8 now, and they can use Drupal 8 now, even though it's still beta, by using it as a decoupled system. That's one approach that people are taking. So we're seeing a lot of optimism as well from front-end developers. Front-end in Drupal has always historically been a little bit tricky. Lots of pre-processing functions and stuff going on. So we're now seeing that front-end developers are much happier because it's got Twig, there's much less, fewer divs all over the place. And what we're also seeing is that Twig has been brought into various other elements of Drupal where we would normally have had to do custom coding front-end functions. And I'm also seeing, anecdotally anyway, general acceptance that the code is easier to read, which you would expect. There's much more structure to the way modules are laid out, because before there was some rules but not many. So you pick up one contrib module over here and another one over here, and they'd be completely different in the way they were set up. So that this is much more structured now, and of course that has multiple benefits in that it makes the code easier, makes it so that anyone coming from the outside who knows a bit of Symfony can look at it and go, yeah, I know where this is, I know what's going on here. So really the question was, is this going to have more than code? Is this going to affect us in more ways? So it's always been hard, as I think I mentioned earlier, to find really, really good Drupal developers. And we're looking now to see if those more experienced developers outside of Drupal could potentially be interested in working here. So we're already seeing it in Vika, so we're able to bring some of our software engineers who are purely PHP or purely Symfony into Drupal projects, and we're hoping to do that more and more without them screaming and kicking all the way. So we hope we can get more junior developers as well. People who are just coming out of university, who are learning these sorts of frameworks right now, and to look at, where are they going to work, what's going to be their tool of choice, and hopefully we can convince some of those people as well. We also need to be in a place where, as I say, Drupal is very popular in the enterprise at the moment. And that's the market that a lot of us are talking to. So we need to make sure that we need to be able to talk to other enterprise systems in a much simpler way. It's always been possible to do web services in Drupal, but only with bolting lots of things together. So having it absolutely in core, that's what's happening. We're seeing Drupal certification now starting to happen. And that's actually, it's a bit of a sticky subject because it's the community itself, the Drupal Association, hasn't managed to achieve a certification yet, but Acquia, who are a company founded by Dries, who are out there basically just doing Drupal, they've done their own certification, which has been quite well accepted actually by the community. They have a number of certifications on site building, developing front-end specialism, back-end specialism, and so on. And that sort of thing is also helping because even though there's always an argument as to whether certification or experience is more important, sometimes when you're in an enterprise situation, it's a box-ticking exercise. Is there certification available for this particular software? So software engineers hopefully now have something they can work with, that they want to work with, that's much more interesting to them. And the site builders with Drupal 8 means they have much more control and much more power in Drupal core than they had before. So enough of the history lesson. Why am I here, really? What does this mean for you? So what I wanted to talk about next is a little bit about some of the things that have changed and some of the side effects of this work in Drupal that might be useful. So one in particular, we work a lot in the e-commerce space, and previously we've used Drupal Commerce for all of our large e-commerce builds. Drupal Commerce 2 is on its way for Drupal 8, so it's something that we're following very closely. But the interesting move they've taken, so if you don't know, Drupal Commerce is created by a company called Commerce Guys, who is also the same company behind Platform SH, who are out there. But what they've done is they've moved some of the really important pieces of the e-commerce framework outside of Drupal, and they've put them out, open sourced them, of course, into Symfony components. So what we've got is the big 5 problems of e-commerce are handling currency, figuring out really complicated pricing, tax, of course, addresses are just a nightmare because of international address formats being different everywhere you go, and payment processing. So what they've done is they've taken those 5 things out of core of Drupal Commerce, because Drupal Commerce used to do all those things anyway, but now there's independent libraries that are out there. And I went over to a code sprint in Paris a while ago now, but it's amazing to see contribution from all these different open source PHP e-commerce platforms, talking, invited by Commerce Guys, to talk about these things. And the aim is that these components could be used elsewhere. Now that's something that we'd never seen in Drupal before. So being able to split out specific functionality for everyone here who works with e-commerce at least, to start to look at. I don't know yet whether this is going to be a pattern, whether we're going to see this more. I hope we are, but this is obviously quite a special case where e-commerce elements are. It was decided that these things hadn't necessarily been handled brilliantly anywhere yet. So and there was good collaboration going on. So we're moving away from hooks in Drupal 8. So Drupal has always had this, again, like this registry, it has this inbuilt system of event control called a hook. So different pieces of code can trigger a hook, and then any other module can listen for that hook. Well, yeah, funny, it sounds exactly like an event subscriber. So what we're going to see is that it's going to be started to be replaced. So if you do come into Drupal, you don't have to worry necessarily about this sort of legacy hook system. It's still going to exist in Drupal 8 because it was such a big thing. As you can see, we already had enough unsettling of the community. If we took out hooks completely, I think for this release it would have been crazy. So what we've seen is some of it's come out, and there's an event subscriber pattern's been put in, but we reckon by Drupal 9, then that's going to be completely event subscriber. Of course, everything's subject to change, but that's the conversation I've seen going on. So we should, I think I'm repeating myself, but we should really should have more accessible code. We should see more common patterns that you'd be used to, much more structured code, many fewer Drupalisms. So Drupalisms is basically when you're just looking at something and going, only in Drupal would you see something like that. Some crazy, why on earth would it be like that? And there could be 10 years of legacy explaining why that is. So hopefully a lot of those will be reduced. And therefore, the reduced barrier to entry, what we're seeing at the moment is even a really good software engineer in PHP needs a few months, probably, to get really good at Drupal. You can do it, but really important in Drupal, and I think it will continue to be, is not bending the system, not trying to jam a Symfony component in where it doesn't need to be. What we see often with people who've not worked with Drupal is that because you don't necessarily understand everything it's capable of doing, you try and reinvent the wheel. I'm sure it's the same with every framework, quite honestly, but we see it quite a lot in Drupal. So what we're hoping to see is this reducing that, making sure that new contributors, new developers, new team members can come in and be really happy with what they see. We're hoping that this sort of mix of the communities is going to be much more useful to everyone. There wasn't much crossover between the communities before, and since then there's been quite an interesting transition. So as I said, we're seeing the Drupalcon, the big Drupal conference, it's called Drupalcon, that's next week in Barcelona, and for the first time there's a Symfony track. So there's normally like 5 different tracks. It's a big thing, it's about 2,000 people will go. So they've got Symfony track for the first time. There's also a pure PHP track. Again, so moving away from the traditional, they've still got the traditional tracks, but just extending out, accepting into the community different types of people. And we expect and we hope that also the fact that Drupal 8, when Drupal 8 is fully launched, is using Symfony in its depth is actually beneficial for Symfony as well. In that, that's what I said in the title of the talk, is changing the community, changing the world one community at a time, and hopefully the next, whichever next framework or system it is that might look at what Drupal's been doing and how we've managed to achieve this, and maybe follow the same path. And we've still got this talent gap. So I explained about the current sort of community of Drupal developers who are in a scary place at the moment. A lot of them, all of them, are learning Drupal 8. They're all learning this new thing. However, the market is big for Drupal at the moment. So it's much more in the market. In the enterprise, you're seeing the likes of BBC, NBC, Royal Mail, Eurostar, these sorts of companies all doing Drupal at a massive scale. So there's a shortage. It's really hard still to find Drupal developers. So what we're looking for is, because we've got more interaction with the traditional Symfony in those companies as well, because big companies tend to have multiple systems, not just one website. So we've got to be able to talk to things. And we've definitely been working with making Drupal talk to Symfony applications. There's definitely some people in the audience that I've worked with here that we've had to talk between those two types of systems. And there's the opportunity, therefore, to work in cross-discipline teams. There's a big opportunity to look at Drupal now. There's a big opportunity in the employment space, in the agency space, in London, in the UK, in Europe, and frankly everywhere. And now's the right time. Drupal 8 has a fixed idea. Again, this was introduced for Drupal 8. Drupal 7 release dragged on a bit, and no one really knew what was going to happen. This time, there's a bug list, issue list. If it's 0, then we go to release candidate. It's 2 at the moment. We all know that it will go to 1, then it will go to 5, then it will go to 4 again. But hey, it's nearly there. We are literally a couple of weeks, probably, from a Drupal 8 release candidate. Not full release, a release candidate. Drupalcon Barcelona is next week, and that will involve, it's a 3-day conference with about 4 or 5 days of code sprints going on as well. So that's when the progress is always made. So we're looking at, now is the right time. Now is that we've already got a beta to beta upgrade path, which we didn't have. So there are people using it. So there are some sites out there, some people a bit crazy, a little bit, if you ask me, going live on a beta, but some sites are out there already. The thing with Drupal is, of course, there's so much functionality in the contributed module space, thousands and thousands of modules. Not all of them we need now, because so much of it is now in core, and that's normally the way things happen. A really good contributed module idea will often make its way into core. So we need the contrib space to catch up. Before we can go mainstream with Drupal 8, we need to make sure that all those little additional modules that you need are going to be there. So the beta to beta upgrade path is there, which means that some people are actually launching now. But it's, of course, special use cases when they don't need these contrib modules necessarily. But we're starting to see it. So what next? That's the question. So my challenge is drop your preconceptions. If you've been in Drupal before, come back, have another look with an open mind. Jump in and help if you can. Although we're quite late in the release cycle, there's still plenty to do. We're also moving to a slightly different release pattern. It used to be just big core updates every 3 or 4, 5 years, whatever. We're now going to be doing point updates, so there's much more likely that things will be changing and more things will be added to core. And Drupal needs you. Drupal is looking desperately for more contributors, more talent, more people to help. It's an open source community, as we all are, so it only survives with its community. And then I threw in a completely shameless plug, but it's the wrong book, because the Drupal 8 book that I'm working on isn't out yet, because Drupal 8 isn't out yet, so forget that. The book will be out soon, so if you follow me, whatever, there's a new Drupal 8 book that we've been working on for about 2 years, which is going to be out soon, and that will help you get into Drupal 8 a little bit more if that's something you're interested in. So yeah, I finished. I've got a few minutes, I've got about 5 minutes or something left. If anyone's got any questions, I'd be very happy to try and answer them. Okay, Marcelo's going to get the microphone, I think.
Hello. Is that working? Yes.
Yep.
So quite a basic question. Have you built anything yet with Drupal 8 or launched anything with it so far?
We haven't launched anything commercially, no. I've done a lot of work in Drupal 8 for writing the book. Unfortunately, we've had to rewrite the book about every 2 months for about 2 years, because every time we went back, we saw all the screenshots had changed, which was really not surprising. We've got some sort of skunkworks experiments going on at the moment as well, especially in headless stuff, like everyone. Looking at that and looking at connecting Drupal 8 to Angular front ends and that sort of thing. I'm trying to think of any good examples at the moment, but there's certainly nothing that we're not out there right now with clients saying, do Drupal 8. We know that, from a release candidate, for the types of sites that we build, we're much more likely to build our own site in Drupal 8 in the next few months, just to see what's going on. But no, nothing. It's a bit risky, if you ask me, for any software to go for a beta for a production site. Has anyone else got any Drupal 8 sites out there? Yeah. It's not impossible. And in fact, Sensio had one, didn't they, for a while?
Should this have been called Drupal 8? Is migrations even possible from 7 to 8, or is it
actually one of the other
from a major site, from a massive site?
One of the other initiatives I didn't mention was there's a migrate initiative in core. So there's not much of a UI on it, but fundamentally it allows us, in fact the focus was on Drupal 6, to migrate from Drupal 6 to 8, and then subsequently from 7 to 8. Because it's massively important. Because Drupal, especially 7 to 8, you don't just plug Drupal 8 into the same database and expect it to work. It's very much a data migration exercise, and that's always been the way with Drupal. There's always been a philosophy that API breaking is okay between major versions because that's how we can progress. If we have to concentrate on maintaining legacy, then we've been significantly further back than we are right now. So it's not trivial, but it is possible. So that's the next thing we'll be looking at.
Any other questions?
Hi. How closely does Drupal 8 match the Symfony APIs, or does it wrap some of the APIs, or are they purely the same?
Yeah. So basically, what you're seeing is that the API, the Symfony stuff, is right in the deep in the bottom of the layers, and then a lot of that's wrapped so that it's exposed, because Drupal has, for example, an entity API. So what you're seeing is a lot of Symfony, should we call code techniques, the actual components themselves are all wrapped. And a lot of people don't like that, and I think it's one step towards where we need to be ultimately. But they're not, so you're not necessarily directly accessing the components.
So that could be a barrier for Symfony developers moving over to.
It could potentially be, but as I say, I would encourage everyone to have a look. That stuff is very deep in the core and understanding of the core, and what we're hoping is that Symfony developers who know the framework can look at it and understand what's been done and why. So Fabien's obviously been quite involved in steering this as well. So, yeah. Anyone else?
Any other questions? So Richard, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Let's give Richard a round of applause.